Imagine a world entirely devoid of sunlight, where the temperature hovers just above freezing, and the weight of the water above creates a crushing force hundreds of times greater than the atmosphere on land. This is the midnight zone of the ocean, a hostile alien realm covering more of our planet than all the land masses combined. In this absolute darkness, life has been forced to adapt in the most bizarre and terrifying ways. Bioluminescent predators with needle-like teeth patrol the void, while colossal invertebrates with eyes the size of dinner plates and tentacles armed with rotating hooks wait in silence. To us, this is a realm of nightmares. But to the inhabitants of the abyss, there is a far greater nightmare that comes from the world above. Every day, dropping like a 50-ton boulder from the sunlit surface, the ultimate apex predator enters their domain. The sperm whale. It is the largest toothed predator on Earth, plunging into the crushing depths not to seek refuge, but to wage war. It is a biological submarine engineered with a level of precision that human technology can only dream of rivaling, designed specifically to hunt down and devour the very monsters we fear most. When a sperm whale dives, the deep sea goes quiet. Today, we will explore exactly why the deep sea fears the sperm whale. We will break down the incredible anatomy, the extreme physiological adaptations, and the devastating acoustic weaponry that make this Leviathan the undisputed king of the abyss. If you're ready to join us on this journey into the dark, feel free to like and subscribe to the channel. Also, drop a comment below letting us know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there right now. We love seeing our global community come together. To understand how this creature conquers the abyss, we must first look at its most defining, disproportionate, and frankly bizarre feature: its head. The head of a mature sperm whale is a true marvel of evolutionary engineering, taking up nearly 1/3 of its entire body length and weighing up to a staggering 16 tons in a fully grown male. If you were to stand directly in front of a sperm whale, the sheer blunt wall of its face would tower over you. Unlike the sleek streamlined skulls of most other apex marine predators, the sperm whale possesses a massive blocky rectangular battering ram of a forehead. But this enormous structure is not made of thick impenetrable bone or incredibly dense muscle. Instead, the vast majority of this space is essentially hollowed out, forming a gigantic internal cranial cavity designed to hold one of the most enigmatic and valuable biological substances on planet Earth. Inside this cavernous cranial vault lies a structure known to science as the Spermaceti organ. Positioned above the upper jaw and extending all the way forward to the blowhole, this organ is fundamentally a massive elongated barrel made of incredibly tough fibrous connective tissue. Below this primary barrel lies a second distinct section of heavily compartmentalized fatty tissue known simply as the junk, which is divided by thick walls of cartilage and connective tissue. The upper Spermaceti organ alone can hold up to 2,000 litres of a remarkably unique, pale, yellowish, oily fluid. When 18th and 19th century whalers first cracked open the skulls of these magnificent beasts after slaughtering them, they discovered this vast, sloshing reservoir of fluid. Because of its milky, cloudy appearance when it cooled on the wooden decks of their whaling ships, these early mariners mistakenly believed it was the whale's seminal fluid. This historical misunderstanding gave the creature its unfortunate common name, the sperm whale, and gave the fluid itself the name Spermaceti. Modern biology and organic chemistry, however, have revealed the true nature of this fluid, and its actual function is far more brilliant and scientifically complex than anything those early whalers could have possibly imagined. Spermaceti is absolutely not a reproductive fluid. It is in fact a highly complex biological wax consisting primarily of specific wax esters and triglycerides, and the key to its immense power lies in its extreme sensitivity to changes in temperature. At the surface of the ocean, where the whale rests, breathes, and recovers from its exhausting trips into the deep, the internal temperature of the whale's head is maintained at roughly 33 to 37 degrees Celsius, which is a standard normal mammalian body temperature. Kept warm at this temperature, the internal spermaceti remains in a clear, completely liquid state. In this liquid state, the wax is relatively lightweight and highly buoyant compared to the surrounding seawater. This is exactly what the whale needs when it is resting at the surface, catching its breath and reoxygenating its massive bloodstream after a deep dive. The millions of drops of liquid wax act together like a massive internal life jacket, passively keeping the animal's blowhole elevated above the water level, with virtually zero physical exertion required from the whale itself. But a biological life jacket is the absolute last thing you want when your biological imperative is to plummet thousands of meters down into the pitch-black ocean. Buoyancy is a massive physical hurdle for air-breathing marine mammals. Water is an incredibly dense, heavy medium. To swim directly against your own natural positive buoyancy in order to reach the ocean floor would require an astronomical expenditure of metabolic energy. The sperm whale, entering a highly hostile environment with a strictly limited supply of oxygen, absolutely cannot afford to waste its muscular energy simply fighting to sink. It needs to save every single ounce of its strength and every last molecule of its oxygen for the violent high-speed struggle against the giant squids that await in the darkness. Therefore, millions of years of evolution have provided the sperm whale with an absolutely ingenious, biologically mechanized solution. The sperm whale does not swim down into the darkness. It alters its own physical density and it simply falls. To initiate a deep dive, the sperm whale executes a flawless masterpiece of thermoregulation and phase change physics. The whale elevates its massive tail flukes out of the water and points its rectangular head downward, beginning its descent. At the exact same moment, it opens a highly specialized muscular nasal passage and intentionally draws in a massive rush of freezing cold ocean water from the surrounding external environment. This freezing water is channeled rapidly through a complex twisting network of nasal passages that wrap tightly around the exterior of the giant spermaceti organ. As the cold water flows past the massive barrel of oil, heat is rapidly drawn out of the spermaceti fluid and transferred directly into the water, which the whale then continuously expels back into the ocean. Furthermore, the spermaceti organ is heavily vascularized, meaning it's surrounded and penetrated by a dense network of blood vessels. During this initial descent, the whale actively restricts the flow of warm, arterial blood from its body core to its head, effectively shutting off its internal biological heater. As the internal temperature within the spermaceti organ rapidly drops below roughly 30 degrees Celsius, a dramatic physical and chemical transformation takes place. The clear liquid oil begins to aggressively crystallize. It undergoes a phase change, transitioning from a warm fluid into a cloudy, dense, heavily compacted solid wax. In the fundamental realm of physics, when a substance cools and solidifies, its constituent molecules are forced to pack much closer together, resulting in a significant increase in physical density and a corresponding decrease in overall volume. As the roughly 2,000 litres of spermaceti wax solidifies within the skull, it shrinks slightly in volume and becomes considerably heavier and denser than the surrounding ocean water. The massive, buoyant life jacket in the whale's forehead has, within a matter of minutes, transformed into an incredibly heavy, dense biological anchor. With its centre of gravity now drastically shifted forward by this dense block of solid wax, the sperm whale enters a state of definitive negative buoyancy. It no longer needs to aggressively kick its powerful tail to swim downward against the resistance of the water. Gravity simply takes over the operation. The whale enters a steep, beautifully effortless glide, plummeting straight down into the midnight zone at a highly efficient speed of around 1 to 2 meters per second. This is an absolute triumph of biological efficiency and fluid dynamics. The whale is effectively getting a totally free ride down to the abyssal hunting grounds, sinking like a massive stone while aggressively conserving nearly all of its muscular oxygen stores for the intense high-speed battle that will inevitably occur when its echolocation strikes a target in the blackness. Fast forward through the brutal realities of the hunt. The battle is over. The whale has successfully hunted and consumed its prey, but it is now thousands of meters deep, surrounded by freezing water that hovers just above 0 degrees Celsius, and its internal oxygen reserves are becoming dangerously depleted. Now, the incredibly heavy biological anchor that pulled it down so effortlessly has become a massive, potentially lethal liability. The whale needs to return to the surface to breathe, and it needs to get there fast. It is time to entirely reverse the thermoregulatory process. The sperm whale ends its hunt, pivots its massive body, and points its head toward the distant, entirely invisible surface. To achieve positive buoyancy and return to the air, the whale opens its internal biological floodgates. Its powerful circulatory system goes into absolute overdrive, actively pumping a massive continuous surge of warm, though oxygen-depleted blood from the heavily insulated core of its body straight into the dense capillary network surrounding the frozen Spermaceti organ. This rush of blood acts exactly like a high-powered biological radiator, blasting internal metabolic heat directly into the frozen block of solid wax. As the temperature within the cranial cavity rapidly climbs back toward 37 degrees Celsius, the second phase change begins. The dense, closely packed solid crystals of wax begin to rapidly melt, aggressively absorbing the metabolic heat and transitioning swiftly back into a clear, buoyant liquid state. As the wax melts, its molecular structure relaxes and the molecules spread further apart. The physical density of the fluid drops significantly, and its overall volume expands to fill the connective tissues. The heavy internal anchor dissolves back into oil, and the massive head once again becomes lighter and significantly less dense than the surrounding highly pressurized water of the deep ocean. The sperm whale successfully shifts its entire physical state from negative buoyancy back to positive buoyancy. Just as it fell to the bottom without effort, it now rises upward toward the light like a massive organic hot air balloon rising through the atmosphere. The whale glides upward, conserving whatever tiny fraction of oxygen it has left in its muscles, coasting perfectly until it finally breaches the surface of the ocean, violently exhaling a massive, explosive plume of condensation into the open air. This elegant, internally controlled buoyancy system is just the very first layer of the sperm whale's incredible deep-sea armory. By actively manipulating the physical state of a biological wax through precise thermoregulation, the whale totally conquers the basic physical forces of gravity and fluid dynamics, turning the immense, forbidding depth of the open ocean from an exhausting physical barrier into a highly energy-efficient highway. But manipulating density to get to the bottom is only half the battle. Once it arrives in the midnight zone, the whale must survive a crushing, unfathomable physical pressure that would effortlessly turn a modern military submarine into a mangled, unrecognizable wreck of compressed metal. Mastering the physics of buoyancy to reach the midnight zone is merely the prologue of the sperm whale's journey. Arriving in the abyss introduces an entirely new, profoundly lethal set of physical challenges. The most immediate and violent of these is hydrostatic pressure. To understand the sheer magnitude of this environment, we must examine the brutal reality of deep water physics. For every 10 meters you descend into the ocean, the weight of the water above adds the equivalent of one entire Earth atmosphere of pressure. By the time a sperm whale reaches a hunting depth of 2,000 meters, the water is exerting a crushing, inescapable force of over 200 times the atmospheric pressure experienced at sea level. If you were to take a standard, hollow steel cylinder and drop it into these depths, the immense weight of the water would instantly crumple it like a discarded aluminum soda can. For biological organisms, particularly air-breathing mammals that evolved on the surface, this level of compression is theoretically catastrophic. The fundamental laws of physics dictate that as external pressure increases, the volume of a gas must proportionally decrease. Inside the body of an air-breathing mammal, the lungs are essentially massive, hollow balloons filled with easily compressible gases. If a human, or a terrestrial animal like an elephant, were subjected to the pressure of the midnight zone, The violent compression of the air inside their chest would cause a horrific implosion. The immense external force of the ocean would push inward against the air cavities, instantly snapping the rigid bones of the rib cage and driving the shattered skeletal fragments directly into the heart and vital organs. So how does a 50-ton mammal, fundamentally possessing the same basic anatomical blueprint as terrestrial creatures, survive an environment that would instantly crush a nuclear submarine? Human engineering dictates that to survive extreme pressure, you must build thicker, stronger, highly rigid walls made of titanium or high-yield steel to violently resist the ocean. Evolution, however, took the exact opposite approach for the sperm whale. The whale survives not by fighting the immense pressure of the abyss, but by entirely surrendering to it. The secret lies in the brilliant, highly specialized architectural engineering of the sperm whale skeleton, specifically its thorax. In terrestrial mammals, the rib cage is a relatively rigid barrel-like structure. The ribs are solidly anchored to the spine in the back and firmly attached to the sternum or breastbone in the front, creating a protective but unyielding cage around the heart and lungs. The sperm whale has completely discarded this rigid blueprint. Its ribs are not fused into a solid, unmoving barrel. Instead, they are highly articulated and connected by incredibly flexible, rubbery ligaments and thick bands of elastic cartilage. As the sperm whale plunges deeper into the blackness and the hydrostatic pressure mounts by the second, its skeletal structure begins to physically transform. The immense weight of the ocean water presses inward against the animal's flanks. Because the rib joints are composed of highly flexible cartilage rather than fixed bone, the entire rib cage simply folds inward. It collapses upon itself, dramatically compressing the whale's chest cavity. By yielding to the pressure rather than resisting it, the sperm whale entirely eliminates the structural stress that would otherwise shatter its bones. There is no rigid resistance, and therefore there is no breaking point. The ocean pushes, and the whale's body gracefully folds. But this massive inward collapse of the chest cavity poses a severe physiological problem for the delicate internal organs, specifically the lungs. As the rib cage folds inward, it violently squeezes the lungs. In a human, this would be fatal. But the sperm whale's lungs are designed precisely for this extreme compression. As the pressure mounts, the lungs completely and entirely collapse. The microscopic, incredibly delicate air sacs deep within the lung tissue, known as alveoli, are squeezed completely shut, entirely flattening out like deflated balloons under a heavy weight. This extreme biological deflation requires a safe storage space for the residual air that was inside those microscopic sacs. As the lungs are flattened by the collapsing ribs, the remaining air is aggressively forced upward, pushed out of the delicate lower lung tissue and driven forcefully into the upper respiratory tract. This air is shoved into the bronchi and the massive trachea, also known as the windpipe. Unlike the delicate alveoli, the whale's upper airways are not designed to collapse. They are heavily reinforced with dense, incredibly thick, overlapping rings of highly calcified cartilage. These structural rings act like heavy-duty, pressure-resistant industrial piping. They are tough enough to withstand the immense, crushing weight of 2 kilometers of ocean water, providing a safe, rigid internal vault where the compressed air can be safely stored while the whale hunts in the dark. This total collapse of the lungs and the forced evacuation of air into the reinforced trachea is not merely a mechanism to survive physical crushing. It is a vital, life-saving biochemical defense mechanism. It is the ultimate evolutionary solution to a deadly phenomenon that plagues human deep-sea divers, known as decompression sickness, or more commonly, the bends. When a human breathes compressed air at depth, the elevated pressure forces large amounts of nitrogen gas to dissolve directly across the thin walls of the alveoli and into the bloodstream and tissues. If that diver returns to the surface too quickly, the sudden drop in ambient pressure causes that dissolved nitrogen gas to rapidly expand and bubble out of the blood, much like carbon dioxide aggressively bubbles out of a freshly opened bottle of soda. In a biological system, these nitrogen bubbles physically block blood vessels, causing excruciating joint pain, massive tissue damage, neurological failure, and ultimately a localized agonizing death. The sperm whale, diving thousands of meters deep and returning to the surface rapidly, should theoretically suffer from lethal cases of the bends on every single hunting trip. Yet, they remain perfectly immune. The anatomical collapse of their rib cage is the key to this biochemical immunity. Gas exchange, the process where oxygen and nitrogen enter the bloodstream, can only occur across the extremely thin, highly permeable membranes of the microscopic alveoli. By allowing the pressure of the ocean to physically crush its lungs shut and force all the remaining air upward into the thick-walled trachea, the whale actively shuts down its internal gas exchange system. The walls of the trachea are far too thick and impermeable for any gases to pass through into the bloodstream. Therefore, even though the sperm whale is surrounded by unimaginable pressure, the nitrogen gas trapped in its upper airways is completely isolated from its blood. No matter how deep the whale dives, or how extreme the hydrostatic pressure becomes, the nitrogen simply cannot dissolve into its cardiovascular system. By surrendering to the crushing weight of the deep ocean and allowing its chest to fold and its lungs to collapse, the sperm whale successfully physically protects its skeleton from shattering and chemically insulates its blood from toxic nitrogen saturation. With the threat of physical implosion entirely neutralized, and the lethal danger of decompression sickness masterfully bypassed through anatomical engineering, the sperm whale becomes a flawless, pressure-proof vessel. It has effectively neutralized the deep ocean's most immediate physical weapons, but surviving the crushing pressure is only one part of the physiological equation. An air-breathing mammal hunting in the absolute depths of the midnight zone faces another, equally relentless biological ticking clock. It has no access to atmospheric oxygen. Shutting down the lungs to survive the pressure means entirely cutting off the primary source of life-sustaining oxygen, forcing the whale to rely on an internal biochemical reserve system of unprecedented power to fuel its high-speed, muscular battles in the dark. As the massive ribcage folds inward and the lungs completely collapse beneath the crushing weight of the midnight zone, the sperm whale effectively severs its own connection to the atmosphere. Gas exchange violently halts. The massive animal is now operating as an entirely closed biological system, an organic submarine isolated in the freezing dark, totally cut off from its primary source of life. This presents a massive biological paradox. The sperm whale is not sinking down to the ocean floor to sleep or conserve energy. It is descending into the abyss to engage in highly energetic, violent, muscular battles with some of the largest and most dangerous invertebrates on the planet. To fuel this explosive kinetic energy, the whale's muscular engine requires an absolutely astronomical supply of oxygen. Yet, it can comfortably hunt in this suffocating darkness for up to 90 minutes, and sometimes even stretch its breath-holding capacity beyond 2 solid hours. To achieve this impossible feat, the sperm whale has completely rewritten the mammalian rules of biochemical oxygen storage and distribution. If a human attempts to hold their breath, they rely heavily on the air physically trapped inside their inflated lungs, which holds roughly 36% of their total available oxygen reserves. The human bloodstream and muscles hold the rest. The sperm whale, however, abandons the lungs almost entirely as an oxygen storage locker. Because the lungs are purposefully collapsed to survive hydrostatic pressure and prevent decompression sickness, they hold a microscopic fraction of the animal's total oxygen, a mere 9%. Instead, millions of years of evolution have relocated the whale's entire life support system into its liquid tissues and its skeletal muscles, turning the animal's own flesh into a massive, heavily concentrated biochemical battery. The first layer of this internal life support system is the bloodstream itself. The sperm whale possesses a remarkably high volume of blood relative to its total body mass. But it is not just the volume of blood that is extraordinary. It is the extreme density of the oxygen-carrying proteins within it. The whale's red blood cells are packed with an overwhelming concentration of hemoglobin. the specialized iron-based protein responsible for binding free oxygen molecules and transporting them throughout the cardiovascular system. This supercharged blood allows the sperm whale to absorb and store a massive payload of oxygen during the brief, explosive periods it spends breathing at the ocean surface. However, the true masterpiece of the sperm whale's biological engineering, the absolute secret weapon that allows it to rule the deep, lies hidden within its massive muscular system. While hemoglobin transports oxygen through the blood, a distinctly different yet closely related protein is required to store oxygen directly inside the muscle fibers for immediate use. This highly specialized storage protein is called myoglobin. Myoglobin acts as a localized, fiercely dedicated biological bank vault for oxygen. It grabs onto oxygen molecules and absolutely refuses to let them go until the muscle cell begins to actively starve and desperately requires fuel for cellular respiration. If you were to look at the raw skeletal muscle tissue of a healthy sperm whale, it would look completely alien compared to the bright red or pink muscle tissue of terrestrial mammals. The flesh of the sperm whale is incredibly dark, appearing as a deep, rich purple or even a bruised, pitch-black colour. This extreme, almost unnatural darkening is the direct visual signature of an unprecedented, extreme concentration of myoglobin. The sperm whale possesses myoglobin concentrations in its skeletal muscles that are up to 10 or even 30 times higher than the concentrations found in terrestrial mammals. The muscle tissue is literally saturated with iron-rich oxygen storage units. But this extreme biochemical saturation presented a lethal evolutionary hurdle. Proteins are complex, folded molecular structures. In normal biological systems, if you pack too many myoglobin proteins into a tiny cellular space, they begin to physically crash into one another. When they collide, their natural chemical tendency is to stick together, clumping up into useless toxic aggregations that destroy the muscle tissue and lead to severe, fatal diseases. If a human somehow possessed the myoglobin concentration of a sperm whale, their muscles would instantly fail. So how does the sperm whale pack such extreme densities of myoglobin into its muscles without the proteins clumping together and destroying its own flesh? The answer is a breathtaking feat of evolutionary molecular biology. The myoglobin molecules in a sperm whale have been genetically modified to possess an extreme net positive electrical charge on their outer surfaces. In the fundamental realm of electromagnetism, like charges violently repel one another. Just as pushing the positive identical poles of two magnets together creates an invisible, unyielding field of resistance, the positively charged myoglobin molecules inside the whale's muscles constantly repel each other. This brilliant electrostatic repulsion acts as a microscopic force field around every single protein, allowing the muscle cells to be packed to the absolute maximum theoretical limit with oxygen-storing myoglobin, while ensuring the molecules never touch, never clump, and never become toxic. With its bloodstream packed with hemoglobin and its black muscles supercharged by electrostatically adapted myoglobin, the whale is heavily armed with oxygen. But surviving for hours in the dark requires more than just a massive fuel supply. It requires extreme, ruthless metabolic rationing. As the whale begins its descent, it triggers an extreme version of a physiological phenomenon known as the mammalian dive reflex. The immediate life-saving priority during a deep dive is the preservation of the central nervous system and the cardiovascular pump. The brain and the heart absolutely cannot survive without a continuous, uninterrupted flow of oxygen. To protect these vital command centers, the sperm whale's autonomic nervous system initiates a highly aggressive, massive peripheral vasoconstriction. The smooth muscles lining the walls of the arteries leading to the extremities, the digestive tract, the liver, the kidneys, and the skin violently contract, squeezing completely shut. The whale literally chokes off the blood supply to its own non-essential internal organs. This extreme biological triage effectively traps the highly oxygenated blood in a tightly controlled, closed central circuit, routing it exclusively between the heart and the brain. ensuring the command center remains wide awake and highly alert in the absolute darkness. Simultaneously, the whale executes a profound reduction in its heart rate, a process known as bradycardia. From a resting surface heart rate of around 60 beats per minute, the sperm whale's heart slows to a creeping, methodical crawl, sometimes dropping to as few as 10 heavily measured beats per minute. This drastically reduces the heart muscle's own oxygen consumption and slows the overall burning of the internal biological reserves. But what about the massive tail muscles that must propel the animal, or the powerful jaws that must crush a giant squid? By ruthlessly cutting off the blood supply to the peripheral muscles through vasoconstriction, the whale forces its muscular system to work in isolation. The muscles of the sperm whale are entirely cut off from the main circulatory system during the hunt. They must rely solely and exclusively on their own internal, localized, massive banks of myoglobin to survive the battle. As the hunt stretches on and the internal myoglobin banks are finally drained, the muscles are forced to switch to anaerobic respiration, a harsh metabolic process that generates energy without oxygen, but produces massive amounts of toxic lactic acid as a byproduct. A terrestrial animal would quickly succumb to muscle cramps and systemic shock from this acid buildup. But the sperm whale's biochemistry is practically immune to this toxicity, calmly tolerating enormous spikes in lactic acid and carbon dioxide in its isolated tissues until it finally returns to the surface. Through highly charged molecular proteins, extreme blood shunting, and ruthless physiological rationing, the sperm whale transforms itself into an unparalleled biochemical machine, capable of carrying the breathable atmosphere directly into the suffocating, crushing void of the midnight zone. But even with a perfect biological submarine and unlimited internal oxygen, the whale is still entering an arena of absolute blinding darkness. To find its prey in a world completely devoid of light, it must deploy the most devastating sensory weapon ever evolved on planet Earth. As the sperm whale perfectly executes its localized biological shutdown and surrenders its massive body to the pull of gravity, it leaves behind the familiar sunlit world of the epipelagic zone. It begins a vertical descent into an environment so profoundly alien and relentlessly hostile that more human beings have walked upon the dusty surface of the moon than have ever visited its darkest depths. To fully grasp the sheer magnitude of the biological war the sperm whale is about to wage, we must first understand the terrifying, suffocating arena in which this battle takes place. This is the bathypelagic region, more ominously and accurately known to marine biologists as the midnight zone. The transition from the surface down into the midnight zone is a journey characterized by the absolute systematic erasure of life-sustaining elements, the most profound of which is light. As the whale plummets past the 200-meter mark, it enters the mesopelagic or twilight zone. Here, the physics of water act as a massive, ruthless filter against electromagnetic radiation. Water molecules rapidly absorb and scatter the photons of sunlight raining down from above. The lower energy, longer wavelengths of the visible light spectrum, such as red and orange, are violently absorbed almost immediately near the surface. As the whale continues to sink, the yellow and green wavelengths are completely stripped away, leaving only a haunting, fading twilight of cold blue light. But even this weak blue light is ultimately defeated. By the time the massive Leviathan crosses the threshold of 1,000 meters of depth, the last surviving photons of solar radiation are entirely extinguished. From this boundary down to the ocean floor, stretching for thousands of meters, exists a realm of absolute, unbroken, suffocating blackness. Stripped of solar radiation, the midnight zone is fundamentally starved of thermal energy. The rapid drop in water temperature, known as the thermocline, violently plunges the ambient environment into a state of near-freezing stasis. Throughout the vast expanse of the bathypelagic, the water temperature stabilizes at a brutal, unwavering 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. It is a world suspended in eternal freezing darkness, because there is absolutely zero sunlight, the foundation of almost all life on planet Earth. The biochemical process of photosynthesis is physically impossible here. There are no plants, no algae, and no massive blooms of phytoplankton to form the base of a traditional food web. Instead, the midnight zone is primarily a biological desert that relies almost entirely on a grim, microscopic phenomenon known as marine snow. This continuous slow-motion blizzard consists of decaying organic matter, flakes of dead skin, clumps of bacteria, and the feces of surface-dwelling animals drifting down from the sunlit world thousands of meters above. This decaying detritus is the meager, nutrient-poor currency that sustains the baseline ecosystem of the abyss. Faced with eternal darkness, freezing temperatures, and an agonizing scarcity of caloric energy, the creatures that inhabit the midnight zone have been forced by evolution to become horrific, highly specialized monsters of efficiency. To survive in an environment where meals are separated by months or even years of starvation, deep-sea predators cannot afford the luxury of a high-speed chase or a heavy, muscular body. Instead, they have evolved into grotesque, gelatinous ambush predators. Their bones are deliberately thin and fragile to conserve the calcium that is nearly impossible to find in the deep water. Their muscles are watery and flaccid, designed not for sustained swimming, but for violent, instantaneous lunges. To overcome the absolute darkness, over 90% of the animals in the midnight zone have developed the ability to manufacture their own biological light, a dazzling but deadly chemical phenomenon known as bioluminescence. Through the highly controlled, localized mixing of a light-emitting molecule called luciferin and an enzyme known as luciferase, these creatures spark brilliant flashes of neon blue and green directly in the pitch-black water. But in the bathypelagic zone, bioluminescence is very rarely used for simple illumination. It is a weapon of deception and death. Deep-sea anglerfish dangle glowing, fleshy lures from their foreheads to hypnotize curious prey, drawing them directly into massive gaping jaws lined with rows of translucent, needle-sharp teeth. Other predators use brilliant flashes of light as a biological burglar alarm to blind attackers, while some utilize complex patterns of glowing photophores to attract mates in a boundless, empty void. The anatomical adaptations required to hunt and survive in this lightless arena are terrifying. Many predators possess jaws that can unhinge entirely, connected to massive, incredibly elastic stomachs capable of swallowing prey significantly larger than their own bodies. A necessary adaptation when you never know when your next meal will appear. To detect movement in the blackness, these creatures rely on highly exaggerated sensory organs. They possess highly sensitive lateral lines stretching across their bodies, tuned to detect the microscopic vibrations of water displacement caused by a struggling fish. And while the environment is devoid of sunlight, many abyssal predators possess enormous bulging eyes with highly concentrated retinas, completely optimized to capture the faintest, microscopic spark of a bioluminescent flash miles away. But lurking within this macabre suspended gallery of glowing horrors is an evolutionary phenomenon that directly sets the stage for the sperm whale's arrival: abyssal gigantism. In the deepest, coldest trenches of the ocean, the combination of extreme hydrostatic pressure, nearly freezing temperatures, and the absolute scarcity of food drastically slows down the metabolic rates of invertebrate animals. While their growth rate slows to a crawl, their overall lifespan increases exponentially. Allowed to grow slowly in the freezing dark over the course of years or decades, certain species of crustaceans and, most importantly, cephalopods attain massive, nightmarish proportions completely unachievable by their shallow water relatives. This is the grim, silent reality of the midnight zone. It is an infinitely vast, freezing void populated by gelatinous, glowing assassins, unhinging jaws, and silent, massive invertebrates suspended weightlessly in the dark. It is an alien world that operates by entirely different biological rules, a world that seems perfectly equipped to murder any air-breathing mammal foolish enough to intrude. Yet, It is precisely into this terrifying abyss that the sperm whale calmly descends. It is not entering the midnight zone as a victim, nor is it merely surviving the conditions. The sperm whale plunges into this horrific arena as the undisputed king, carrying within its massive, heavily armoured skull a localised sensory weapon, so powerful and so devastating that it renders the absolute darkness of the abyss completely irrelevant. As the sperm whale glides into the pitch-black void of the midnight zone, the profound absence of sunlight becomes entirely irrelevant. While the bizarre, gelatinous predators of the abyss rely on massive, highly sensitive eyes to capture the microscopic, fleeting sparks of bioluminescence, the sperm whale entirely discards the concept of visual hunting. Over millions of years of brutal evolutionary refinement, this apex predator has traded the biological need for ambient light for the absolute mastery of acoustic physics. The sperm whale does not need to look into the darkness because it possesses the biological machinery to physically illuminate the ocean with sound. To hunt down the giant squid hidden in the abyssal expanse, the whale deploys the single most powerful, highly directional natural sonar system ever to exist on planet Earth. The origin of this devastating acoustic weapon lies hidden within that massive rectangular head we examined earlier. While the millions of litres of wax inside the spermaceti organ and the underlying junk compartment act as an ingenious buoyancy control system, their primary, most critical biological function is entirely acoustic. The entire upper third of the sperm whale is in reality a colossal, highly complex bioacoustic cannon. To fire this weapon, the whale does not use vocal cords. At the crushing depths of the midnight zone, forcing precious air out of the lungs to vibrate fleshy cords in the throat would be a massive, lethal waste of oxygen. Instead, the sperm whale has evolved a highly specialised, entirely internal pneumatic sound generation system that recycles its air supply without ever losing a single molecule to the surrounding ocean. This system begins at the very front of the whale's massive snout, situated just beneath a single asymmetrical blowhole on the left side of its head. However, it is the right nasal passage that has been radically heavily modified by evolution, exclusively for the production of sound. Deep within this right nasal passage, near the front of the enormous blocky forehead, sits a pair of heavily muscled, hardened anatomical structures, known formally to science as the phonic lips, or historically referred to as the monkey lips. These lips operate as a massive high-pressure pneumatic valve. As the whale prepares to fire an acoustic pulse, it forces a highly compressed volume of trapped air upward from a muscular sac located deeper in its head. This heavily pressurized air is driven violently through the tight, unyielding seal of the phonic lips. As the air forcefully wedges its way through, the lips are violently sucked back together by a massive drop in aerodynamic pressure, creating a sharp, explosive physical clap. This instantaneous snapping together of the hardened phonic lips generates a singular, incredibly sharp broadband acoustic pulse. To human ears, listening through underwater microphones, it simply sounds like a loud, sharp click. However, when this click is initially generated at the very front of the whale's head, it is completely unfocused and essentially travelling in the wrong direction. If the sound were to simply radiate outward into the water from the front of the whale's face, it would scatter widely and harmlessly, rapidly losing its energy in the vastness of the ocean. To transform this raw, chaotic acoustic pulse into a devastating long-range weapon, the sperm whale must drastically manipulate the physics of the sound wave before it ever leaves its body. Instead of exiting the blowhole, the acoustic energy of the click is deliberately fired backward, directed straight into the massive 2,000-litre barrel of the spermaceti organ. This is where the true brilliance of the whale's acoustic engineering becomes apparent. The spermaceti organ is not just a vat of wax, it is a highly tuned acoustic waveguide. The physical density and the specific chemical composition of the spermaceti oil make it a near-perfect conductive medium for sound waves. Because the speed of sound through this highly specialized wax is significantly different, than the speed of sound through the surrounding muscle and connective tissues, the spermaceti organ acts exactly like a biological fibre optic cable. The acoustic wave is trapped within the barrel, preventing the sound energy from bleeding out through the sides of the whale's head, aggressively channeling the immense force of the click directly backward toward the rear of the skull. Travelling backward through the spermaceti at incredible speed, the acoustic pulse violently strikes the rear wall of the cranial cavity. Here, evolution has shaped the sperm whale's skull into a massive concave wall of incredibly dense bone, heavily padded with a highly specialised layer of trapped air known as the frontal sac. In the fundamental physics of sound, an extreme mismatch in acoustic impedance, such as the boundary between dense bone, a pocket of air and liquid wax, creates an absolute barrier. When the sound wave strikes this barrier, it cannot pass through into the brain. Instead, the concave skull acts as a gigantic parabolic acoustic mirror. Just like a massive radar dish or a highly polished reflector inside a powerful flashlight, the skull captures the backward travelling sound wave and perfectly reflects it, bouncing the entirety of the acoustic energy forward again. But the reflected sound wave does not return through the spermaceti organ. The precise geometry of the parabolic skull angles the reflected sound downward, directing it directly into the lower half of the whale's massive forehead, the compartmentalized structure known as the junk. The junk is constructed of a highly complex series of fat bodies, perfectly separated by thick, disc-like walls of heavily calcified connective tissue. As the sound wave travels forward through these sequential compartments, it is subjected to an incredibly precise biological phenomenon. The compartmentalized fats within the junk possess varying acoustic densities. As the sound wave pushes through these varying layers, the speed of the wave slightly alters, causing the sound to bend and refract. The entire junk organ functions precisely like a massive array of sequential acoustic lenses. With every compartment the sound wave passes through, the acoustic energy is further refined, collimated and squeezed tighter and tighter together. The messy, scattered energy of the initial click is forcefully corralled by these biological lenses, completely stripping away any chaotic frequencies. By the time the sound wave finally reaches the flat, squared-off front of the whale's snout, it has been transformed from a raw, chaotic snap into a highly focused, perfectly organised, concentrated beam of pure acoustic energy. The acoustic beam is then violently forcefully projected out of the whale's face and directly into the freezing water of the midnight zone. The sheer physical power of this fully amplified acoustic beam is almost entirely beyond human comprehension. Acoustic pressure is measured in a unit called decibels. In the open air, a normal human conversation registers at roughly 60 decibels. A rock concert or a loud siren peaks at around 120 decibels, the threshold where sound begins to cause immediate physical pain to the human ear. A massive jet engine at close range, tearing the air apart, produces an agonizing 140 to 150 decibels. The directed acoustic click of a fully grown male sperm whale, heavily amplified by its cranial parabolic mirror and concentrated by its acoustic lenses, blasts out of its forehead at an astonishing 230 decibels. It is vital to understand that comparing underwater decibels directly to atmospheric decibels requires complex mathematical conversions due to the severe differences in the physical density and reference pressures of water versus air. However, even factoring in the physics of underwater acoustics, a blast of 230 decibels is unequivocally catastrophic. It is widely considered by marine acousticians to be the loudest biological sound ever recorded on the planet. This acoustic output is so incredibly powerful that it ceases to be merely a loud noise and physically manifests as a violently destructive wall of kinetic pressure. Water is largely incompressible, meaning that when an acoustic wave of this magnitude tears through it, the water molecules are violently shoved forward, creating a localized high-speed shock wave. If a human diver were somehow able to survive the crushing depths of the midnight zone and found themselves floating directly in front of a sperm whale firing its primary sonar, the sheer physical force of the acoustic blast would be utterly devastating. The pressure wave would aggressively tear through the diver's body, vibrating their skeletal structure, violently compressing any trapped gas in their tissues, and practically pulverizing their internal organs simply through the raw transfer of kinetic acoustic energy. This is the ultimate weapon of the abyss. The sperm whale does not passively swim through the darkness, hoping to randomly bump into a meal. It actively, violently, aggressively interrogates the abyss. By firing these massive 230 decibel blasts of directed sonic energy into the blackness, the sperm whale turns the entirely lightless environment into a highly detailed, illuminated battlefield, sweeping its massive head back and forth like a biological searchlight. Every single object hidden in the freezing depths is aggressively struck by this wall of sound, setting the stage for the most advanced biological data processing system on Earth to decode the returning echoes and locate the monsters lurking in the dark. When the devastating, highly concentrated acoustic shockwave of the sperm whale tears through the impenetrable blackness of the bathypelagic zone, it aggressively interrogates every cubic meter of water in its path. Eventually, this wall of kinetic energy collides with a physical object suspended in the abyss, perhaps a jagged outcropping of the rocky ocean floor, or far more importantly the soft fleshy mantle of a colossal squid. The moment the sound wave strikes this biological target, a tiny fraction of that acoustic energy bounces off the squid's body and is violently reflected back toward the whale. However, traversing thousands of meters of dense ocean water twice severely degrades the energy of the sound wave. By the time the returning echo reaches the massive head of the sperm whale, the explosive 230 decibel blast has been reduced to an incredibly faint, microscopic whisper. Capturing and deciphering this microscopic whisper requires an entirely different, highly specialized bioacoustic reception system. Terrestrial mammals rely on external ears to funnel sound waves traveling through the thin medium of air directly into their ear canals. In the ocean, this system is entirely useless. Because the physical density of a whale's skin and muscle tissue is almost identical to the density of the surrounding seawater, sound waves do not bounce off the exterior of the whale's head. They pass cleanly straight through it. If the sperm whale relied on standard mammalian ears, the returning echo would simply wash through its skull completely undetected. To solve this critical flaw, millions of years of evolutionary engineering transformed the sperm whale's lower jaw into a highly tuned, exceptionally sensitive biological antenna. The lower jawbone, or mandible, of the sperm whale is unusually long, narrow, and fundamentally hollow at its base. The incredibly thin bone near the rear of the jaw is known as the pan bone. Behind this paper-thin layer of bone lies a massive channel of highly specialized acoustic tissue known as the mandibular fat pad. This fat pad is chemically distinct from the normal blubber covering the rest of the whale's body. Its molecular composition is explicitly designed to flawlessly conduct returning sound waves. When the faint returning echo strikes the whale, it is instantly absorbed by the massive lower jaw. The jaw physically vibrates, transferring the acoustic energy through the pan bone and directly into the specialized fat pad. This fatty channel acts precisely like a biological funnel, physically guiding the microscopic sound vibrations directly into the heavily armored bony casing of the whale's middle and inner ear, completely bypassing the exterior flesh of the head. Once the acoustic vibration strikes the inner ear, it is aggressively translated into electrical nerve impulses and fired directly into the sperm whale's auditory nerve. This is where the raw data of the echo meets the most sophisticated biological processor on the planet. The auditory cortex of the sperm whale is phenomenally massive and intensely complex, explicitly wired to calculate the extreme mathematics of acoustic physics in a matter of microseconds. When the brain receives the electrical signals, it calculates the exact time delay between the initial click being fired and the echo returning. Because the speed of sound in water is a constant measurable factor, roughly 1,500 meters per second, the whale's brain instantly and flawlessly calculates the precise distance to the target. Furthermore, by measuring the microscopic difference in the time it takes the echo to arrive at the left side of the jaw versus the right side of the jaw, the whale triangulates the target's exact geometric coordinate in the darkness. As the whale rapidly fires sequential clicks, it measures the Doppler shift, the compression or stretching of the returning sound waves, to instantly determine whether the target is moving toward it or swimming away, and at exactly what velocity. But the sperm whale's echolocation goes far beyond simple location and speed. The acoustic processor is so incredibly refined that it can analyze the subtle alterations in the frequency of the returning echo. Different materials absorb and reflect sound in distinct ways. The hard, chitinous beak of a squid will reflect a sharper acoustic signature than the soft, gelatinous tissue of its mantle. By processing these minute differences in frequency absorption, the sperm whale does not just detect a blob in the darkness. It generates a highly detailed, real-time, three-dimensional acoustic holograph of its prey inside its mind. The whale can theoretically determine the exact size, the species, and even the internal biological density of the squid hiding in the pitch-black void. This acoustic mastery introduces one of the most fiercely debated and terrifying scientific hypotheses in marine biology, the Big Bang Theory, also known as acoustic stunning. For decades, scientists struggled with a massive biological paradox regarding the sperm whale. The whale is a massive, heavily insulated, slow-moving mammal. The giant squid, its primary prey, is a highly streamlined, jet-propelled invertebrate, possessing the largest eyes in the animal kingdom and incredibly fast muscular reflexes. By all logical biological metrics, the fast, agile squid should easily outmaneuver the bulky whale in the open ocean. Furthermore, when scientists examined the stomach contents of dead sperm whales, they frequently found completely intact, unchewed giant squids without a single bite mark on their bodies. How does a slow whale capture a lightning-fast squid without completely shredding it in the process? In the 1980s, marine biologists proposed a terrifying evolutionary explanation. They hypothesized that the sperm whale does not merely use its sonar to locate the squid. It weaponizes the raw acoustic power to physically incapacitate it. As the sperm whale closes the distance on its located prey, it shifts its sonar from slow, methodical search clicks to a rapid, continuous barrage known as a terminal buzz. During this terminal buzz, the whale fires hundreds of heavily amplified clicks per second directly at the target. The hypothesis suggests that at point-blank range, the sheer physical kinetic force of a 230 decibel acoustic barrage is enough to violently paralyze the squid. When sound of this magnitude strikes a biological organism, it can cause catastrophic internal damage. In fish, extreme acoustic pressure waves forcefully rupture their internal, air-filled swim bladders, instantly killing them. Giant squids do not possess air-filled swim bladders, which led some scientists to initially doubt the stunning hypothesis. However, squids possess incredibly delicate, highly sensitive internal balance organs known as statocysts, which dictate their spatial orientation and jet propulsion reflexes. A point-blank barrage of intense acoustic shock waves could theoretically overload or physically shatter these delicate neurological organs. Striking the statocysts with rapid-fire kinetic energy would leave the massive squid totally disoriented, structurally paralyzed, and completely helpless in the water, entirely unable to trigger its jet propulsion. While proving the acoustic stunning hypothesis definitively in the extreme depths of the midnight zone remains a monumental technological challenge for modern science, the anatomical evidence heavily supports the terrifying reality of this weapon. The sperm whale possesses no teeth in its upper jaw, only functional teeth in its lower mandible, suggesting it does not need to aggressively grab and tear struggling prey. It simply needs to securely hold paralyzed prey before swallowing it whole. Whether the terminal buzz physically shatters the squid's internal organs or simply violently overloads its highly sensitive nervous system through massive sensory shock, the result is identical. In the suffocating darkness of the abyss, once a sperm whale achieves a solid acoustic lock on a target, the massive 230 decibel weapon ensures the battle is often won before the whale even opens its jaws. While the devastating acoustic armory of the sperm whale may seem like an insurmountable evolutionary advantage, it is absolutely critical to understand that this massive Leviathan does not dive into the abyss to hunt defenseless, docile creatures. The biological targets locked inside its acoustic crosshairs are some of the most formidable, heavily armed, and scientifically terrifying invertebrates to ever exist on planet Earth. To fully appreciate the sheer violence of the abyssal war, we must turn our analytical focus away from the mammalian invader and examine the physiological masterpiece of its arch nemesis, the giant squid, known to science as Architeuthis dux, and its even more massive, heavily armoured cousin, the colossal squid, Mesonicoteuthis hamiltoni. These creatures are the ultimate horrifying beneficiaries of abyssal gigantism. Suspended weightlessly in the crushing, freezing darkness, these cephalopods have evolved to nightmarish proportions. A fully grown female giant squid can reach total lengths of up to 13 metres, while the colossal squid, though slightly shorter in overall length, possesses a far more massive, incredibly dense muscular mantle. These are not simply overgrown versions of the small squids found in shallow coastal waters. They are entirely distinct, highly specialised abyssal predators equipped with biological systems engineered for absolute extremes. While the sperm whale has entirely surrendered its reliance on vision to master the physics of sound, the giant squid has taken the exact opposite evolutionary trajectory. To survive in the midnight zone, the giant squid possesses the largest, most highly developed eyes ever recorded in the history of the animal kingdom. Measuring up to 27 centimetres across, these massive ocular organs are roughly the size of large dinner plates. The pupils alone can expand to 9 centimetres in diameter. In an environment devoid of sunlight, constructing and metabolically maintaining such enormous eyes is a massive biological investment. But for the squid, it is a matter of absolute survival. These colossal eyes are not designed to see in pitch blackness, which is physically impossible, but rather to capture the faintest microscopic singular photons of light generated by bioluminescence. When a 50-ton sperm whale plummets through the midnight zone, its massive displacement violently agitates millions of microscopic, bioluminescent plankton and jellies. This triggers a cascading, glowing outline of the whale's descent. The squid's massive retinas are perfectly tuned to detect this very specific wavelength of blue bioluminescence from up to 120 metres away. Long before the acoustic clicks of the whale reach a lethal, paralysing threshold, the squid's massive eyes can visually detect the glowing, ominous silhouette of the impending threat. When that visual data is registered, it is processed by one of the most advanced and fascinating nervous systems in the invertebrate world. Because the squid relies on explosive, instantaneous bursts of speed to ambush its own prey and to evade the sperm whale, its neurological signals must travel from its brain to its massive muscular mantle with zero delay. To achieve this lightning-fast reflex time, the squid has evolved specialised neurological pathways known as giant axons. In terrestrial mammals, nerve fibres are microscopic, heavily insulated to speed up electrical transmission. The squid, lacking this specific type of insulation, solved the problem of neurological speed through sheer physical scale. Its axons are massively thick, measuring up to 1 millimetre in diameter, making them hundreds of times thicker than human nerve fibres. This massive diameter drastically reduces internal electrical resistance, allowing action potentials, the electrical impulses that trigger muscle contractions, to rocket through the squid's body at incredible velocities, ensuring an instantaneous full-body mechanical reaction. At the center of this high-speed neural network sits a highly complex centralized brain. However, the anatomical placement of this brain presents one of the most bizarre and perilous design flaws in nature. The giant squid's brain is shaped like a dense neurological donut, and it physically wraps directly around the animal's esophagus. This means that every single piece of food the squid swallows must pass directly through the center of its brain on its way to the stomach. If the squid were to swallow a chunk of prey that was too large or heavily armored, the expanding esophagus would violently press outward against the surrounding neurological tissue, effectively giving the squid highly localized, potentially lethal brain damage. This terrifying anatomical constraint dictates the necessity of the squid's primary feeding weapon. Hidden at the very center of the squid's twisting mass of arms is a massive, razor-sharp beak. Composed of heavily cross-linked chitin and incredibly tough structural proteins, this weapon resembles the beak of a giant parrot. The musculature powering this beak is so exceptionally strong that it can easily sever thick steel cables. The squid uses this devastating tool to meticulously shear and heavily shred its prey into tiny, manageable fragments, ensuring the food can safely pass through the center of its brain without causing neurological catastrophe. But to bring prey to the beak, or to defend itself against the crushing jaws of a sperm whale, the squid relies on a horrifying array of highly specialized appendages. The giant squid possesses 8 thick, heavily muscled arms and 2 incredibly long, highly elastic feeding tentacles. These tentacles can shoot outward with explosive speed to grab a target. The inner surfaces of all these appendages are lined with hundreds of powerful suction cups. In the giant squid, these suction cups are not merely soft, fleshy vacuums. The inner rim of every single cup is lined with a hardened, serrated ring of sharp chitin. When the squid grabs a target, the suction applies massive negative pressure, actively dragging these serrated, saw-like teeth deep into the flesh of the victim. The colossal squid, however, possesses an even more devastating, nightmarish biological arsenal. Instead of merely relying on serrated suckers, the colossal squid's massive tentacles are armed with rows of large biological hooks. These razor-sharp structures are mounted on rotating, highly muscular swivels. When a colossal squid strikes, it does not just grab. It violently embeds these swiveling hooks deep into the blubber and muscle tissue of its attacker. Once the hooks are set, pulling away only drives them deeper. Finally, powering this entire massive, heavily armed biological machine is an extreme form of aquatic locomotion, highly pressurized jet propulsion. The squid draws massive volumes of freezing ocean water into its muscular mantle cavity. By violently contracting the thick muscles of its body, it forces the trapped water out through a highly flexible, highly directional biological nozzle known as the siphon. This explosive ejection of water propels the massive invertebrate backward at terrifying speeds, making it one of the fastest, most agile creatures in the abyssal zone. This is the biological reality of the sperm whale's prey. It is not a helpless victim waiting in the dark. It is a massively intelligent, incredibly fast, heavily armed biological dreadnought, equipped with the largest eyes in the world, a high-speed nervous system, serrated biological chainsaws, and swiveling meat hooks. When the high-velocity acoustic shock waves of the sperm whale finally collide with the massive glowing eyes of the giant squid, the abyss becomes the arena for a brutal, high-stakes collision between the absolute pinnacle of mammalian acoustic engineering and the terrifying razor-sharp mastery of invertebrate evolution. As the terminal buzz of the sperm whale reaches a deafening, paralyzing crescendo, the abyssal arena erupts into absolute chaos. The collision between these two biological titans in the pitch-black void of the Midnight Zone is a terrifying spectacle of violent kinetic energy and desperate survival. We know this not because any human camera has ever captured the climax of this deep-sea war, but because the sperm whale carries the grim, indisputable forensic evidence of the battle permanently carved into its own flesh. When a mature sperm whale returns to the sunlit surface to breathe, a close inspection of its massive blocky head reveals a biological canvas heavily scarred by unimaginable violence. The thick, dark grey skin is invariably covered in a chaotic web of bright white, circular scars and long, deep parallel gouges. These are not the random marks of ocean debris or mating rituals. They are the direct mechanical signatures of the giant squid's desperate defence. As the massive jaws of the sperm whale snap through the freezing water, the squid violently deploys its primary defensive perimeter. Its 8 heavily muscled arms and 2 highly elastic feeding tentacles whip furiously in the dark, desperately seeking purchase on the whale's face. When the tentacles strike, the hundreds of highly specialized suction cups latch violently onto the whale's skin. The intense negative pressure engages the serrated chitinous rings lining the inner edge of every single sucker. These biological saw blades dig relentlessly into the whale's epidermis. As the 50-ton mammal thrashes its massive head to position the squid for the final, crushing bite, the squid frantically holds on, tearing those serrated rings completely through the whale's flesh, leaving agonizing, perfectly circular tracks of torn tissue. If the opponent is the heavier, more terrifying colossal squid, the battle damage is significantly worse. Instead of merely leaving circular suction scars, the colossal squid violently buries its rotating razor-sharp biological hooks deep into the whale's face. As the enormous mammal rolls and thrashes to break the invertebrate's grip, these hooks act exactly like massive meat cleavers drag through soft tissue, slicing long, brutal, parallel trenches across the whale's snout and jaw. Yet, despite this horrific, agonizing defensive barrage, the sperm whale rarely loses the engagement. The whale's primary defense against this lacerating weaponry is its incredibly thick, heavily reinforced layer of blubber, which can be up to 30 centimeters thick. While the squid's hooks and suckers violently tear the outer skin, they rarely penetrate deeply enough to strike vital organs or sever major arteries. The whale simply absorbs the phenomenal pain, relying on its overwhelming physical mass, its devastating acoustic shockwaves, and its crushing lower mandible. Eventually the heavy jaws clamp shut, severing the squid's nerve centers or violently crushing its massive mantle. The struggle ends. The mighty cephalopod is consumed, often swallowed whole or torn into massive bloody chunks, plunging down into the dark cavern of the whale's highly specialized multi-chambered stomach. However, the biological war does not truly end when the prey is swallowed. While the squid's watery flesh and soft tissues are rapidly dissolved by the intensely corrosive bath of hydrochloric acid, within the whale's primary stomach chamber, a profound, potentially lethal internal crisis remains. Hidden within the gelatinous mass of every consumed squid is that massive parrot-like beak, composed of heavily cross-linked chitin. This organic polymer is practically indestructible to standard mammalian digestive enzymes. Over a single hunting trip, a sperm whale may consume dozens of squid. Over a lifetime, it will swallow millions. While the soft tissue melts away, thousands of these razor-sharp, heavily armoured beaks are left entirely intact, accumulating in a massive, dangerous pile inside the whale's stomach. To pass this indigestible, heavily abrasive biological shrapnel through the delicate, twisting labyrinth of its lower intestines is a massive physiological gamble. A single sharp beak rotating sideways could effortlessly slice open the intestinal lining, causing catastrophic internal bleeding, fatal sepsis, and localized tissue death. To survive its own highly successful diet, roughly 1 to 5% of the global sperm whale population engages an incredibly rare, deeply fascinating biochemical defense mechanism. When a massive accumulation of sharp squid beaks manages to slip past the stomach and begin severely irritating the delicate lining of the lower intestines, the whale's highly specialized biliary system aggressively responds. The bile ducts begin pumping out massive quantities of a complex, fatty, cholesterol-rich biological wax, heavily saturated with a specific chemical compound known as ambrine. This thick, viscous wax rapidly coats the irritating mass of sharp beaks, acting exactly like biological cement. It encases the razor-sharp chitinous edges in a smooth, heavily lubricated protective shell, completely neutralizing the threat of internal laceration. As the whale continues to digest its food, this waxy protective mass aggressively absorbs water and violently compacts itself, cementing thousands of separate squid beaks together into a single, highly dense, solid biological boulder. This concretion, trapped deep within the whale's digestive tract, slowly grows over the course of years or even decades. Eventually, the massive smooth boulder becomes too large to remain in the gut. The whale must forcefully expel it into the ocean. While marine biologists actively debate whether the mass is violently regurgitated through the mouth like a colossal hairball, or passed painfully through the rectum, the end result is exactly the same. A massive, incredibly dense, foul-smelling black lump of highly concentrated biological waste is forcefully ejected into the freezing waters of the open ocean. Once this dense biological boulder hits the surface of the sea, an astonishing, highly complex chemical transformation begins. Because the mass is highly saturated with fatty waxes, it is positively buoyant. It drifts aimlessly across the surface of the ocean for years, relentlessly baked by ultraviolet radiation from the sun and heavily oxidized by the aggressive salinity of the seawater. Over a massive span of time, the harsh fecal odor of the raw waste is completely destroyed through photodegradation. The internal chemical structure of the ambrine compound slowly breaks down, evolving and maturing into one of the most complex, highly sought-after, and astronomically expensive biological substances on planet Earth. Ambergris. The fully cured ambergris entirely loses its horrific origins, transforming into a pale greyish mass that emits a remarkably sweet, earthy, highly complex marine musk. For centuries, the global luxury perfume industry has ruthlessly hunted for these floating treasures. The unique molecular structure of ambergris acts as the ultimate chemical fixative, allowing the delicate, highly volatile aromatic compounds of expensive perfumes to bind heavily to human skin and last indefinitely. Thus, the most brutal, relentlessly violent predatory collision in the darkest depths of the midnight zone ultimately yields a profound biological paradox. The horrific, razor-sharp weapons of the giant squid, safely encased by the whale's desperate intestinal biochemistry, are cast into the ocean to be refined by time and salt, eventually washing ashore as the ultimate highly prized treasure of terrestrial luxury. But this bizarre chemical alchemy is only a small fraction of the whale's internal complexity. To truly understand the mind of the creature that actively chooses to wage this deep-sea war, we must descend from the darkness of its stomach and examine the absolute marvel of its neurology. To truly comprehend the absolute mastery of the sperm whale, we must descend from the dark, acidic, highly corrosive environment of its digestive tract and examine the biological command center that actively orchestrates this entire deep-sea war. Hidden deep within the incredibly massive, heavily armoured skull, positioned safely behind the colossal, 2,000-litre acoustic cannon of the Spermaceti organ, lies the ultimate biological processor. It is not merely a control mechanism for a massive body. It is a neurological marvel that fundamentally challenges human assumptions about intelligence, consciousness, and emotional depth. The sperm whale possesses the largest, heaviest, and most neurologically complex brain known to have ever existed in the entire history of planet Earth. To understand the sheer scale of this biological supercomputer, we must first look at the raw physical metrics. The average human brain, which we proudly consider the absolute pinnacle of terrestrial evolution, weighs roughly 1.3 to 1.4 kilograms. The brain of a mature male sperm whale completely obliterates this statistic. It tips the scales at an astonishing 8 to 9 kilograms, making it more than 6 times heavier than the human brain. In terms of sheer volume, the sperm whale brain occupies roughly 8,000 cubic centimeters of space within the cranial vault. It is a massive, heavily convoluted sphere of specialized tissue that requires an enormous, constant supply of highly oxygenated blood to maintain its metabolic functions, heavily protected by the extreme biological triage of the dive reflex we explored earlier. However, in the field of comparative neuroanatomy, raw weight and volume are only a fraction of the cognitive equation. For decades, scientists argued that because the sperm whale possesses a massive 50-ton body, it naturally required a massive brain simply to coordinate its basic muscular movements and organ functions, a metric known as the encephalization quotient. But modern magnetic resonance imaging and detailed cellular autopsies have entirely shattered this dismissive assumption. The true cognitive power of the sperm whale does not simply lie in the size of its brain, but in the terrifyingly complex architecture of its outer layer, the cerebral cortex. In mammalian brains, the cerebral cortex, and specifically the evolutionary newer neocortex, is the undisputed seat of higher-level cognitive functions. This is where sensory perception, spatial reasoning, conscious thought, and complex language are processed. In order to maximize the processing power of the cortex without expanding the skull to impossible, lethal proportions, evolution relies on a brilliant physical workaround known as gyrification. This is the process where the surface of the brain heavily folds, wrinkles, and deepens upon itself, packing a massive amount of cortical surface area into a highly restricted, finite biological space. The human brain is heavily gyrified, presenting a deeply wrinkled appearance that grants us a cortical surface area of roughly 2,500 square centimeters. The brain of a sperm whale, however, takes the physical concept of gyrification to an absolute biological extreme. Its neocortex is so heavily folded, so intensely convoluted with incredibly deep, tightly packed fissures, that its total cortical surface area is exponentially larger than that of a human. This staggering expanse of grey matter is practically unparalleled. A significant portion of this massive, heavily folded cortex is undoubtedly dedicated to the sheer, mind-bending computational power required to process its acoustic reality, transforming the microscopic, incredibly faint echoes of a 230 decibel sonar blast into a flawless, real-time, high-resolution, three-dimensional holographic map of the midnight zone requires a neurological bandwidth that human technology cannot yet fully replicate. But acoustic processing alone does not explain the entire architectural complexity of the sperm whale's neocortex. When marine neurobiologists finally managed to slice into the deep cortical layers of the cetacean brain and examine the tissue under high-powered electron microscopes, they discovered a cellular anomaly that completely revolutionized our understanding of alien intelligence. They found massive, staggering concentrations of highly specialized nerve cells known as spindle neurons, or von Economo neurons. In the fundamental wiring of a standard mammalian brain, most neurons are highly localized, featuring thousands of tiny branches called dendrites that connect directly to their immediate neighbors. Spindle neurons entirely abandon this localized blueprint. They're incredibly large, long, and exceptionally highly specialized nerve cells shaped like elongated, tapering tubes. Instead of talking to their immediate neighbors, spindle neurons act as high-speed biological fiber optic cables, completely bypassing the dense, slow, local networks to forge highly direct, lightning-fast connections across vast, entirely separate regions of the brain. For many years, evolutionary biologists firmly believed that spindle neurons were an exclusive, highly prestigious biological signature of the great apes. On land, they are found almost exclusively in humans, chimpanzees, gorillas, and highly social animals like elephants. In the human brain, these high-speed neural highways are specifically concentrated in the anterior cingulate cortex and the frontoinsular cortex. These are the highly specific neurological regions strictly dedicated to the most complex, profoundly advanced traits of human nature. Spindle neurons are the biological hardware that allows for rapid, intuitive decision-making in highly complex social situations. More importantly, they are the absolute physical foundation of social cognition, emotional intelligence, the perception of intense grief, the capacity for profound love, and the incredibly advanced cognitive concept of a theory of mind. The conscious understanding that other individuals possess their own unique thoughts, feelings, and internal realities. The discovery of these cells in the ocean completely shattered human exceptionalism. The sperm whale does not just possess spindle neurons, it possesses them in massive, overwhelming quantities. The sheer density and highly strategic placement of these high-speed emotional processes in the sperm whale's brain absolutely dwarf the concentrations found in the human brain. Furthermore, the evolutionary lineage of these cells is completely distinct. Humans and great apes evolved spindle neurons roughly 15 million years ago. The ancestors of the sperm whale evolved these exact same highly complex emotional processes roughly 30 million years ago. This means that heavily advanced, profoundly deep emotional intelligence existed in the dark oceans tens of millions of years before the first hominids ever stood upright on the African savanna. This terrifyingly advanced neurological architecture fundamentally shifts our entire understanding of the sperm whale. The massive biological submarine hunting in the abyss is not a mindless, instinct-driven eating machine. The presence of such a heavily folded neocortex, packed entirely with extreme densities of high-speed emotional processors, strongly implies that the sperm whale possesses an internal emotional life and a level of conscious, social perception of staggering depth and complexity. They do not use this massive brain to build physical cities of stone and steel, nor do they use it to forge tools or harness fire, because the physical reality of the ocean completely precludes such things. Instead, they use their unparalleled cognitive hardware to build something entirely invisible, yet infinitely more complex. They use it to map the absolute void, to remember the acoustic signatures of specific individuals across entire oceans, and to forge bonds of familial love and loyalty that dictate their survival in a relentlessly hostile universe. This massive brain is not an isolated supercomputer. It is a vital node in an incredibly vast acoustic biological network. To truly witness the ultimate output of this massive brain, we must observe how these leviathans organize themselves in the open ocean, forging a complex multi-generational society that operates by rules we're only just beginning to decode. The staggering neurological architecture we just explored, the massively folded neocortex heavily saturated with high-speed spindle neurons, does not exist in a vacuum. Evolution does not invest such an astronomical amount of metabolic energy into building a 10-kilogram biological supercomputer simply to process sonar echoes. The sheer density of emotional processing hardware in the sperm whale's brain is the foundational biological engine for one of the most highly complex, tightly structured, and culturally rich societies on planet Earth. To survive the infinite, relentlessly hostile expanse of the open ocean, the sperm whale entirely discards the concept of a solitary, individual existence. Instead, they weave an intricate, deeply interconnected biological civilization held together across thousands of miles of water by the invisible threads of familial love and a highly formalized acoustic language. At the very core of this society is the matrilineal family unit. The fundamental social structure of the sperm whale is exclusively female-led and fiercely multi-generational. When a female sperm whale is born into the warm tropical or subtropical waters of the ocean, she is born into a permanent, lifelong biological contract. She will never leave the specific family group, or pod, into which she was born. These pods consist of grandmothers, mothers, daughters, sisters, and aunts, creating a heavily bonded, closed society of roughly a dozen adult females who will spend their entire 50 to 70-year lifespans swimming side by side. The male sperm whales, however, face a drastically different, profoundly lonely biological destiny. as young males reach physical maturity and the massive hormone-driven changes of puberty take hold, they are actively systematically pushed out of the matrilineal pods. These solitary, wandering bulls embark on massive isolated migrations, travelling thousands of miles away from the warm equatorial waters, heading directly into the freezing, storm-battered latitudes of the Arctic and the Antarctic. There, they spend decades hunting alone in the absolute extremes of the planet, growing into massive 50-ton giants. They will only return to the warm waters for brief, highly aggressive mating seasons, before vanishing back into the freezing isolation of the poles. They play absolutely no part in raising the offspring or maintaining the social fabric of the pods. The complex society of the sperm whale is an entirely female-driven phenomenon. The biological necessity for this tightly knit matrilineal structure becomes incredibly clear when we examine the absolute vulnerability of a newborn sperm whale calf. While the adult females are flawless, heavily armoured biological submarines capable of plummeting thousands of metres into the freezing high-pressure environment of the midnight zone, the newborn calf is physically completely incapable of following them. Its delicate, unformed rib cage cannot withstand the crushing hydrostatic pressure. Its lungs cannot safely collapse, and its tiny muscles lack the extreme concentrations of myoglobin required to store enough oxygen for a 90-minute battle in the dark. Therefore, when a mother sperm whale must dive into the abyss to hunt to produce the highly fat-rich milk her calf desperately needs, the calf must remain floating at the sunlit surface, utterly alone. In the open ocean, an isolated, defenseless baby whale is an immediate, highly visible target for the ocean's other apex predators, most notably massive, highly coordinated pods of killer whales or orcas, as well as large oceanic sharks. If the sperm whale operated as a solitary mother, her calf would be slaughtered the moment she descended into the darkness. To completely neutralize this threat, the matrilineal pod employs a highly sophisticated, deeply synchronized system of communal care known to science as alloparenting, or simply babysitting. When a mother initiates a deep dive, she leaves her calf in the strict, highly attentive care of its aunts and grandmothers. The adult females in the pod operate on a complex, perfectly timed biological rotation. While some hunt in the depths, others deliberately remain at the surface, physically flanking the vulnerable calf and aggressively shielding it from any potential threats. If a pod of killer whales attempts an ambush, the adult female sperm whales execute a flawless, highly militarized defensive maneuver known as the Marguerite Formation. The massive adults arrange themselves into a tight, perfect circle. They position the delicate calf directly in the center of this biological fortress, pointing their massive, highly muscular tail flukes outward toward the attacking orcas. Any predator attempting to breach the circle is met with a devastating, highly coordinated barrage of tail slashes, each capable of shattering bones and causing fatal internal trauma. The spindle neurons heavily concentrated in their brains actively process the intense empathy and fierce familial loyalty required to literally put their massive bodies on the line to defend a calf that is not biologically their own. But to organize such a highly complex system of babysitting rotations, defensive formations, and coordinated surface intervals across miles of open ocean, the whales require an incredibly advanced communication system. While the 230 decibel, highly focused acoustic clicks are deployed strictly for echolocation and hunting in the deep, the sperm whale entirely alters its acoustic machinery when interacting with its family at the surface. When socializing, they do not fire continuous rapid-fire sonar blasts. Instead, they generate distinct, highly structured, rhythmic sequences of clicks known strictly to marine bioacoustics as codas. A coda is fundamentally an acoustic pattern. It might sound like 3 rapid clicks, a brief pause followed by 2 slower clicks, or 5 evenly spaced clicks. These rhythmic sequences operate exactly like a highly formalized biological Morse code. But the true scientific marvel of the coda system lies in its breathtaking complexity and its role as an absolute identifier of identity and belonging. These coders are not hardwired into the whale's genetics. A sperm whale calf is not born knowing its family's specific acoustic patterns. Instead, just like a human infant slowly learning to speak by intensely listening to and mimicking its parents, the sperm whale calf must actively learn its family's coders through a long, highly complex process of vocal learning. For the first few years of its life, the calf endlessly babbles, producing messy, chaotic strings of clicks until it finally masters the precise rhythmic timing and acoustic cadence of its family. As marine biologists deployed vast arrays of underwater hydrophones to record and mathematically analyze millions of these click sequences across the globe, they discovered a profoundly beautiful reality. Every single matrilineal family possesses its own unique, highly specific coder repertoire. It is their family name, broadcast loudly across the ocean. Furthermore, families that share similar coder patterns frequently associate with one another, forming massive ocean-wide supergroups known as acoustic clans. An acoustic clan can consist of hundreds of different families and thousands of individual whales, all sharing the same fundamental acoustic dialect. These clans are so distinct that if two different acoustic clans physically cross paths in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, they will completely ignore one another. They will not interact, they will not socialize, and they will absolutely not interbreed, simply because they do not speak the same acoustic language. They are entirely separate biological nations, physically sharing the exact same waters, but completely segregated by their learned acoustic dialects. This acoustic segregation brings us to the most profound, deeply paradigm-shifting realization regarding the sperm whale. The transmission of these unique coders from generation to generation represents the strict scientific definition of culture. In biology, culture is defined as information or behavior that is shared within a community and actively acquired through social learning from group members, completely entirely independent of genetic inheritance. The sperm whale possesses one of the most complex, highly formalized non-human cultures on the planet, and this culture dictates far more than just the language they speak. Different acoustic clans possess entirely distinct, culturally transmitted behaviors. Some clans have learned to hunt in highly synchronized, sweeping lines, while others dive in completely staggered, solitary patterns. Some clans possess highly aggressive, confrontational strategies when faced with killer whales, while other clans have culturally learned to rely on silent, evasive fleeing tactics. They learn specific, highly detailed navigational routes across thousands of miles of featureless ocean, passing down the memory of productive hunting grounds and safe breeding areas from grandmother to mother to daughter over the course of centuries. When a sperm whale pod communicates at the surface, heavily rubbing their massive bodies against one another and firing highly complex rhythmic coders into the water, we are not simply watching animals acting on raw biological instinct. We are witnessing the highly sophisticated interactions of a massive, culturally rich, deeply emotional civilization of the sea. It is a civilization completely unburdened by technology, possessing no written history, yet entirely unified by the invisible, unbreakable bonds of an acoustic language and a shared cultural memory passed down through the absolute darkness. To fully appreciate how such a magnificent, neurologically advanced civilization came to exist in the harshest environment on the planet, we must violently turn back the geological clock and trace their incredible journey through deep evolutionary time. The sperm whale is a biological paradox. It is the undisputed king of the deep ocean, yet its fundamental anatomy betrays a shocking truth. It does not truly belong there. Deep within its heavily muscled pectoral flippers lie the distinct, unmistakable skeletal structures of 5 fingers, a wrist, and a forearm. Deep within the massive muscles of its lower back float 2 tiny, seemingly useless bones, the vestigial remnants of a pelvis and hind legs. The sperm whale is an air-breathing mammal. It is a creature whose ancestors once walked on solid ground. To understand how a terrestrial animal transformed into a 50-ton biological submarine, we must violently turn back the geological clock and trace one of the most radical, astonishing evolutionary journeys in the history of life on Earth. The story begins roughly 50 million years ago, during the early Eocene epoch. If you were to stand on the muddy shores of the ancient Tethys Sea, a massive shallow ocean that once separated the continents of Eurasia and Africa, you would not see a massive Leviathan breaching the surface. Instead, you would encounter a creature known as Pachycetus. Pachycetus did not look like a whale at all. It was a four-legged, heavily muscled, carnivorous mammal, roughly the size of a modern wolf. It possessed a long snout, sharp teeth designed for tearing meat, and 4 distinct legs with hooves. It was a terrestrial predator. However, fossil evidence reveals that Pachycetus possessed a highly specialized, incredibly dense bone in its inner ear, a unique anatomical signature found only in modern cetaceans, proving unequivocally that it was the earliest known ancestor of the whale. Driven by the intense competition for resources on land and the irresistible lure of a shallow sea teeming with abundant, slow-moving fish, Pachycetus and its evolutionary descendants began to spend more and more time wading into the water. Over the incredibly vast span of millions of years, the brutal, unrelenting physical demands of the aquatic environment began to aggressively reshape their mammalian bodies. Evolution is a ruthless arms race of physical efficiency, and water is an incredibly dense, unforgiving medium. To swim faster and expend far less metabolic energy, the bodies of these early ancestors became highly streamlined. The front legs gradually flattened, the finger bones entirely fusing together beneath thick layers of connective tissue to form broad pectoral flippers strictly used for steering. The hind legs, no longer needed to support the massive weight of the body against the gravity of land, slowly shrank and eventually disappeared almost entirely, leaving only those tiny, vestigial pelvic bones buried deep inside the lower muscle tissue. Simultaneously, the spine heavily elongated and thickened, culminating in a massive horizontally flattened tail fluke. Unlike fish, which move their tails from side to side, these evolving marine mammals retained the vertical, up and down spinal motion of a running terrestrial animal, beautifully translating the physiological mechanics of a gallop into a highly powerful, aquatic, undulating stroke. Even more radically, the foundational anatomy of their respiratory system fundamentally migrated. Breathing through the front of the face while swimming continuously at high speeds is hydrodynamically terribly inefficient. Over millions of generations, the nasal opening slowly drifted upward, migrating from the tip of the snout all the way to the absolute top of the skull, eventually forming the modern blowhole. This brilliant anatomical shift allowed the creature to instantly exchange massive volumes of air without ever needing to break its forward momentum or lift its heavy head out of the water. By roughly 34 million years ago, during the Oligocene epochs, the ancient whales had fully severed their ties to the land. But the ocean was rapidly changing. Global temperatures began to heavily plummet, completely altering the entire marine food web. This massive ecological shift directly triggered the great evolutionary divergence of the cetaceans. One lineage, the Mystaceti, or baleen whales, evolved massive, comb-like keratin structures in their mouths, entirely abandoning teeth to filter feed on the exploding populations of microscopic plankton and krill near the sunlit surface. But the second lineage, the Odontoceti, or toothed whales, chose a radically different path. They remained highly active, aggressive predators, and to hunt successfully in the rapidly cooling, increasingly murky open oceans, they evolved the ultimate biological miracle of echolocation. Within this specific lineage of toothed whales, the ancestors of the sperm whale, known scientifically as the Physeteroidea, recognized a massive, entirely unexploited biological frontier. While other toothed whales, like the ancestors of modern dolphins and killer whales, remained primarily near the surface to hunt fast-moving schools of fish, the early sperm whales looked downward. They began to aggressively target the deep, completely lightless abyss, an environment entirely ignored by other mammalian predators, but heavily populated by massive, deeply nutritious cephalopods. Committing fully to the midnight zone required severe, extreme anatomical specializations. To survive the crushing hydrostatic pressure of the deep sea, their rib cages became highly flexible and completely collapsible. To hold their breath for hours in the absolute dark, their biochemistry aggressively prioritized the mass production of electrostatically charged myoglobin in their blood and muscles, but the most radical physical transformation occurred directly in the skull. To aggressively hunt the largest, most heavily armed squids in absolute darkness, they needed a sonar system of unparalleled, devastating power. Evolution heavily distorted the entire architecture of their faces. The upper jaw lost all functional teeth, becoming a massive, flat skeletal platform explicitly designed to support the colossal, multi-chambered Spermaceti organ. The cranium violently warped backward to form a giant parabolic acoustic mirror. The head grew exponentially to encompass 1/3 of the entire body mass, completely transforming the animal from a sleek, fast-swimming surface predator into a massive, heavily armoured deep-sea acoustic cannon. The modern sperm whale is not merely an animal. It is the breathtaking culmination of 50 million years of relentless, highly targeted evolutionary engineering. It is the living, breathing testament of a four-legged land-dwelling predator that confidently walked off the shores of an ancient sea, slowly surrendered its legs, violently reshaped its own skeleton, and aggressively rewired its mammalian biochemistry to absolutely conquer the darkest, most highly pressurized, and most relentlessly hostile environment on planet Earth. The ocean is fundamentally a deeply divided ecosystem, strictly segregated by the harsh physical laws of gravity and light. In the upper 100 meters, known as the epipelagic or sunlit zone, there is an absolute abundance of solar radiation. This light is the vital fuel required for photosynthesis, the biochemical engine that sustains almost all life on Earth. However, there is a massive biological catch. Because gravity relentlessly pulls heavy, decaying organic matter, dead organisms and loose particulate matter downward, the sunlit surface layer is aggressively stripped of essential, life-sustaining chemical nutrients. Conversely, thousands of meters below in the midnight zone, the water is intensely saturated with heavy concentrations of nitrogen, phosphorus, and most crucially, iron. These nutrients accumulate in the abyss as a thick, nutrient-rich sludge, but because there is absolutely zero sunlight, they remain entirely locked away, biologically useless to the photosynthetic organisms that desperately need them. The ocean is effectively a locked vault. The fuel is at the top, but the fertilizer is trapped at the bottom. For millions of years, the absolute isolation of these two marine layers severely limited the overall biological productivity of the global oceans. But the evolutionary emergence of the sperm whale provided the Earth with an astonishing, highly dynamic biological solution. The sperm whale is not merely an apex predator moving through a static environment, it is a massive 50-ton biological elevator violently smashing through the ocean's stratified layers. By perfectly mastering the extreme physiological adaptations required to hunt in the abyss and breathe at the surface, the sperm whale effectively became the single most powerful, highly efficient nutrient transport system on the planet, an ecological phenomenon known explicitly to marine biologists as the whale pump. To understand how this massive biological pump operates, we must trace the precise metabolic timeline of the sperm whale's hunting cycle. When the whale plummets into the deep to hunt the giant squid, it is consuming prey that has grown and thrived entirely within the nutrient-dense bathypelagic zone. The fleshy mantle and highly developed nervous system of the giant squid are densely packed with heavy concentrations of deep-sea nitrogen and highly concentrated iron. When the whale violently consumes the squid, it heavily internalizes those abyssal nutrients. However, as we explored earlier, during the extreme hydrostatic pressure and oxygen deprivation of the deep dive, the whale's autonomic nervous system aggressively restricts blood flow to its digestive tract, essentially pausing its digestive metabolism to conserve precious oxygen for its brain and muscles. Therefore, the whale does not heavily process its food or expel its waste in the deep ocean. It waits. After a successful hunt, the sperm whale returns to the sunlit surface to aggressively reoxygenate its massive blood supply and rest. It is here, basking in the warm, nutrient-poor surface waters, that its massive digestive system reactivates. When the sperm whale ultimately defecates, it does not release solid, heavy waste that would simply sink back down into the dark. Because the whale's diet consists almost exclusively of highly gelatinous, water-rich squids, its biological waste is expelled as a massive, highly buoyant liquid plume of bright reddish-brown feces. This liquid biological waste is an absolute biochemical miracle for the surface ecosystem. It is phenomenally rich in precisely the limiting nutrients that the sunlit zone desperately lacks. A single, massive plume of sperm whale feces releases millions of highly concentrated milligrams of pure iron directly into the photic zone. In the chemistry of the upper ocean, iron is the ultimate limiting factor. It is the fundamental biological trigger required for cellular growth. The moment this incredibly dense, highly buoyant cloud of liquid iron and nitrogen hits the sunlit water, it acts as a colossal, biological fertilizer bomb. Instantly, the microscopic single-celled marine plants known as phytoplankton aggressively swarm the nutrient plume. Starved of iron, these dormant microscopic organisms absorb the whale's waste and immediately trigger an explosive, highly aggressive phase of cellular division and massive biological reproduction. Within a matter of days, the waters surrounding a resting pod of sperm whales transform into a massive, thriving, intensely green bloom of millions of tons of phytoplankton, stretching for miles across the otherwise barren surface of the open ocean. This localized biological explosion triggers a massive cascading chain reaction across the entire global food web. The exploding populations of phytoplankton provide an infinite buffet for microscopic zooplankton, which in turn feed massive schools of fish, which ultimately feed dolphins, sharks, seabirds, and eventually human populations. By violently dragging the nutrient wealth of the abyss up to the starving surface, the sperm whale practically single-handedly engineers its own highly productive, localized oasis in the middle of the biological desert of the open sea. But the ecological majesty of the whale pump extends far beyond simply feeding the local marine food web. It directly ties the deep-sea hunting patterns of the sperm whale to the fundamental chemical balance of the entire global climate. When the phytoplankton aggressively bloom by consuming the iron-rich whale feces, they must simultaneously perform massive amounts of photosynthesis. To do this, they rapidly absorb vast, staggering quantities of carbon dioxide directly from the surface waters. Because the ocean is in a constant state of chemical equilibrium with the Earth's atmosphere, as the phytoplankton pull carbon dioxide out of the water, the ocean aggressively pulls more carbon dioxide out of the open air to replace it. This means that every single time a sperm whale fertilizes the ocean's surface, it is triggering a massive biological vacuum that actively sucks heat-trapping carbon dioxide directly out of the Earth's atmosphere. When those microscopic phytoplankton eventually die, a significant portion of them slowly sink back down into the deep ocean, permanently taking that trapped carbon with them and safely locking it away in the abyssal mud for thousands or even millions of years. This process is known as biological carbon sequestration. Before the era of industrial commercial whaling, when global populations of sperm whales numbered well over 1 million individuals, the sheer scale of this biological pump was practically incomprehensible. Marine scientists strictly calculate that the historical global population of sperm whales physically extracted millions of metric tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere every single year, entirely simply through the mechanical act of digesting deep-sea squid and defecating at the sunlit surface. Therefore, the sperm whale is not just a terrifying acoustic hunter or a massive biological submarine. It is the ultimate highly active gardener of the global ocean. It acts as an unbreakable, highly efficient biological conveyor belt, constantly fighting the relentless pull of gravity by diving into the freezing darkness to retrieve the heavy elements of life and bringing them back into the light. In its eternal violent war against the giant squid, the sperm whale inadvertently orchestrates the chemical breath of the entire planet, perfectly stabilizing the global climate and ensuring the continuation of life both below the waves and high up on the terrestrial continents. The Midnight Zone is a realm of absolute suffocating darkness, crushing physical pressure and freezing temperatures. It is an alien world that seems explicitly designed to entirely destroy any biological intruder from the sunlit surface. Yet, as we have thoroughly explored, the sperm whale does not just survive the abyss, it entirely, effortlessly dominates it. This 50-ton Leviathan is the breathtaking culmination of 50 million years of relentless evolutionary engineering. It is a flawless biological submarine that actively bends the fundamental laws of buoyancy and entirely bypasses the lethal physical threats of massive hydrostatic pressure and decompression sickness. It is a supreme biochemical marvel that heavily modifies its own cellular proteins, transforming its pitch-black muscle tissue into an enormous localized oxygen battery to survive for hours without a single breath of atmospheric air. Armed with the most powerful, devastatingly loud natural acoustic weapon ever recorded on planet Earth, the sperm whale violently tears through the absolute blackness of the bathypelagic zone, turning the void into a highly illuminated, real-time, three-dimensional holographic battlefield. It fearlessly descends to wage a brutal, high-speed war against the giant squid and the colossal squid, surviving razor-sharp serrated suckers and swiveling biological meat hooks, only to magically transform the indigestible, heavily armoured beaks of its enemies into ambergris, one of the most chemically complex and highly prized substances in human history. But far beyond the sheer physical violence and unprecedented anatomical mastery, we have uncovered a creature of profound, staggering emotional intellect. Possessing the absolute largest brain to ever exist, heavily wired with incredibly dense concentrations of high-speed emotional processors, the sperm whale operates within a deeply complex, fiercely loyal matrilineal society. They communicate across the open ocean through highly formalized acoustic coders, passing down entirely distinct cultural identities, navigational memories, and specialized hunting tactics across centuries. They definitively prove that deep emotional intelligence, alloparenting, and advanced cultural legacy existed in the dark oceans tens of millions of years before humans ever walked the earth. Furthermore, their very existence is absolutely intrinsically tied to the survival of the entire global ecosystem. As the ultimate biological pump, they relentlessly harvest the heavy, trapped nutrients of the deep abyss and transport them back to the sunlit surface. Their massive, iron-rich biological waste actively triggers immense phytoplankton blooms that aggressively rip vast quantities of carbon dioxide directly out of our atmosphere, continuously stabilizing the global climate and providing the baseline oxygen we breathe. Yet, despite their absolute mastery of the deep sea, these highly intelligent leviathans remain incredibly vulnerable to the relentless, aggressive expansion of the human surface world. While the brutal, bloody era of commercial whaling has largely ended, modern anthropogenic threats are far more insidious. Industrial ocean noise pollution actively blinds their highly sensitive acoustic processors, effectively deafening them in the dark. Massive accumulations of ocean plastic perfectly mimic the gelatinous bodies of their prey, causing fatal intestinal blockages that no internal biochemistry can cure. To aggressively protect the sperm whale is not simply an act of saving a magnificent animal, it is to actively preserve the fundamental biological architecture, the ancient cultural heritage, and the very chemical breath of the global ocean itself. If you found this deep dive into the abyss fascinating and want to continue exploring the absolute extremes of biology with us, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, drop a comment below letting us know where in the world you're watching from, and exactly what time it is there right now. We love seeing our global community come together to learn about the incredible titans of our planet,